1944. West Texas. 3:47 in the afternoon. The sun hung low over Camp Hearn like a copper disk pressed against an anvil sky. Heat rose in visible waves from the parade ground where 200 German prisoners worked under the watch of tower guards whose silhouettes cut black against the glare. The air tasted of alkali dust and creosote, that particular flavor of Texas that gets into your throat and stays there. Wyatt Callahan stood by the horse corral with a hammer in one hand and a fence staple in the other, 61 years old, and lean as drought-season cattle, fourth-generation Texan whose hands knew the weight of tools the way a pianist knows keys. He'd been replacing rotted fence posts since dawn work that let him think about nothing except the grain of the wood and the bite of the staple and the satisfying thunk when the hammer drove true. Then he heard chains. Not the rattle of tack or the clink of a gate latch, but something else. Something that made him stop mid-swing and turn toward the processing yard 100 feet away, where a canvas-covered transport truck had pulled up near the administration building. 8 women climbed down from the truck bed, or tried to. They moved in a strange, shuffling gait, taking steps that were too small, too careful, like people learning to walk again after a long sickness. It took Wyatt 3 seconds to understand why. Leg irons. Metal bands around each woman's ankles connected by 18 inches of chain that caught the late afternoon sun and threw back little sparks of light with every shuffling step. Standard security protocol for high-risk transfers, though these women looked about as dangerous as Sunday school teachers. Thin, all of them wearing the shapeless grey uniforms of auxiliary prisoners, communications specialists probably. Maybe clerical workers, the kind of women who'd filed papers and operated switchboards and gotten caught in the machinery of a war they'd never asked for. The 8th woman, the last one off the truck, was blonde. Mid-20s, Wyatt guessed, though it was hard to tell through the film of road dust that covered her face. She paused at the top of the truck bed, steps gripping the rail, working up the courage for a descent that should have been simple. The chains caught on something. The metal step maybe, or the lip of the truck bed. The woman's foot twisted. She fell. Not hard exactly, just a stumble that turned into a slow-motion collapse as the chains prevented her from catching herself properly. She hit the ground with her shoulder, rolled onto her side, and lay there in the dust while 2 guards moved forward to help her up. She didn't cry, didn't make a sound. Just lay there for maybe 5 seconds with her eyes open, staring at nothing, and Wyatt saw in that stillness something that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. Not pain, not fear, just emptiness. The look of someone who'd been broken so many times that breaking again didn't even register anymore. The guards helped her to her feet. Professional, not unkind, but they didn't remove the chains. She continued shuffling toward the processing building with that same degrading gait, metal scraping concrete with every step, and Wyatt Callahan stood there with a hammer in his hand, thinking about his wife, Sarah. Dead 3 years now from the cancer that had eaten through her like acid through tin. She'd made him promise something in those last weeks when the morphine wasn't quite enough to kill the pain, but was enough to make her speak truths she'd kept polite and buried during 40 years of marriage. Don't let grief make you cruel, Wyatt. When I'm gone, you'll want to curl up inside yourself and let everything go hard and cold. Don't do that. Choose kindness, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. Promise me. He'd promised. Oh, then he'd broken that promise for 2 months straight. July 18th, 1944. 8 weeks and 2 days ago. War Department telegram delivered to his door by a boy on a bicycle who couldn't meet his eyes. We regret to inform you that your son, Private Miles Callahan, was killed in action on July the 6th, 1944 in Normandy, France, while serving his country with honor and distinction. Miles. 24 years old, good with horses, better with engines, best at making people laugh. Born in this house, raised on this land, sent off to war with a kiss and a handshake, and the kind of confidence young men have when they think they're immortal. Dead in a French field with German bullets in his chest, Wyatt had burned the telegram in the kitchen stove, told no one. Not his daughter Ruth, who was working as a nurse in San Antonio and who deserved to know her little brother was gone. Not the neighbors who asked after Miles every time they saw Wyatt in town. Not Captain Ashford at the camp where Wyatt worked as civilian ranch foreman, managing the agricultural operations and prisoner work details. He just woke up every morning at 4:30, made coffee, worked until dark, came home, ate something that tasted like sawdust, and fell into bed too exhausted to dream. Grief like a stone in his chest that he couldn't cough up and couldn't swallow down. Just there, always there, getting heavier. And now he stood watching a German woman shuffle in chains, and something Sarah had said came back to him with the force of revelation. Cruelty is always a choice, Wyatt, and kindness is always possible. He dropped the hammer, left the fence post half secured, walked straight across the yard toward the administration building, while the other prisoners stopped working to watch this tall Texan with dust on his boots and something fierce in his face cut across the compound like a man on a mission. Captain Edward Ashford looked up from his paperwork when Wyatt came through the door without knocking. 38 years old, West Point, educated, served in North Africa before being assigned stateside to run this prisoner of war facility for German combatants captured across the Mediterranean theater. Good man, fair man, but a man who lived by regulations the way priests live by scripture. Wyatt, something wrong with the livestock. Take them off. Ashford blinked, set down his pen. I'm sorry. The leg irons, the women who just arrived, take them off. Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying Wyatt with the kind of careful attention you give to dogs that might be going rabid. That's transport security protocol, Wyatt, applied by the sending facility in Louisiana. We remove them after the prisoners are processed and secured in the compound. Standard procedure. I don't care about procedure. Take them off now. These are enemy prisoners. They're communications personnel, Wyatt interrupted, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and dangerous. Auxiliaries, they never fired a shot, never hurt anyone. They're about as dangerous as church mice, and you've got them shuffling around in chains like animals. Ashford's face remained carefully neutral. The regulations allow for restraints during transport. It's legal under Geneva Convention provisions. Legal doesn't mean right. But I don't make the rules, Wyatt. I just follow them. Then break them. Wyatt put both palms on Ashford's desk and leaned forward. You're the camp commander. You've got discretion. Use it. The two men looked at each other across 3 feet of desk space and 30 years of different life experiences. Ashford had gone to the academy, served with distinction, built a career on following orders and maintaining discipline. Wyatt had broken horses and mended fences and buried a wife, and learned that sometimes the only thing that matters is whether you can look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. Why do you care? Ashford asked quietly. You've never objected to security protocols before. What makes this different? And here it was. The thing Wyatt had told no one. The weight he'd carried alone for 8 weeks, because speaking it out loud would make it real in a way he couldn't survive. Because my son died killing Germans 2 months ago. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Ashford went very still. Miles, Normandy, July 6th. Got the telegram July 18th. Haven't told anyone until right now. Wyatt's voice stayed steady through pure force of will. And if I can stand here knowing Germans put bullets in my boy and still see those women as human beings who deserve to walk without chains, then the chains are wrong. Period. Take them off. Ashford sat back, ran a hand through his hair, looked at the paperwork on his desk like it might contain an answer that wasn't there. If I do this, he said slowly, it sets a precedent. Other prisoners might expect similar treatment. It could complicate security protocols across the entire camp system. Good, Wyatt said flatly. Let it complicate things. Let prisoners expect to be treated like people instead of livestock. That's a precedent worth setting. Ashford was quiet for a long moment. He thought about regulations and security and the careful balance between control and humanity that governed prisoner of war operations. The leg irons were legal, they were protocol, they were probably defensible if anyone questioned the decision, but he also thought about something that had happened in North Africa back in '43 when he'd been responsible for a group of captured German soldiers during a supply shortage. He'd made the call to keep them in an unshaded holding area during a heat wave because moving them would have required resources he didn't have. 6 men died of heat stroke, all by the book, all within regulations, all perfectly legal. He still saw their faces sometimes when he closed his eyes. "Wait here," Ashford said. He stood up, put on his cap, and walked out of his office and across the yard to where Sergeant William Hayes was supervising the intake of the 8 women. 200 male prisoners working on various details around the camp had started to notice something unusual was happening. Word spread in that silent way it does in closed communities where everyone watches everyone else for signs of change in the routine. The 8 women stood in a loose group near the processing building, still shackled, confused and frightened, and trying not to show it. The blonde woman who'd fallen had dust ground into her uniform. She stared at the ground with the blank expression of someone who'd learned that looking guards in the eye was a mistake. Ashford stopped in front of them, spoke in careful German, the kind of textbook pronunciation that came from study rather than natural fluency. "You are prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection. You will be treated fairly according to international law. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will work in capacities allowed by convention protocols. You will not be abused. You will not be mistreated." He paused. Then he turned to Sergeant Hayes and said in English loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear, "Remove the leg irons." Hayes froze. "So transport security protocols require—" "I'm aware of the protocols, Sergeant. I'm also aware that these women pose no security threat. Remove the irons, that's an order." The processing yard went absolutely silent. 200 prisoners stopped what they were doing. Guards in the towers turned to watch. The German women stood unmoving, not understanding the English but recognizing from Ashford's tone that something significant was happening. Hayes hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. Then he pulled out his keyring and knelt in front of the first woman. The metal cuffs opened with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. They fell away from her ankles and hit the ground with a clang that echoed off the barracks walls. Hayes moved to the second woman. Click, clang. Third woman. Click, clang. One by one, the chains came off. The blonde woman was 8th. She stood trembling slightly as Hayes knelt before her as if waiting for some trick, some cruelty disguised as mercy. The sergeant unlocked the right cuff first, then the left. The metal fell away. She stood there with freed ankles, staring down at her own feet like she didn't quite believe what had just happened. When all 8 women were unchained, Ashford spoke again in German. "You will not be shackled while in this camp unless you violate regulations or attempt escape. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings deserving of basic dignity. I expect you to conduct yourselves accordingly." Complete silence. The kind of silence that builds when 200 people are holding their breath at the same time, waiting to see what happens next. Then Wyatt Callahan stepped forward. He'd been standing near the corral, maybe 50 feet away, watching the whole thing. Now he walked across the yard in that long, easy stride men develop when they spend their lives covering distance between fence posts and water troughs. He stopped next to Ashford, removed his hat in that automatic gesture of Texas courtesy, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Captain's a good man, fair man. You women work hard, follow the rules, you'll be treated right here. That's a promise." His voice carried across the yard, roughened by 4 decades of dust and wind and unfiltered camels, but absolutely sincere. The German women didn't speak, couldn't speak. They just stood there with freed ankles and expressions that showed they didn't understand what had just happened or why. Wyatt looked at the blonde woman, the one who'd fallen. Their eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. He gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement you give to another human being when words aren't adequate. Then he put his hat back on and walked back to his unfinished fence post. The work detail resumed. Guards returned to their positions. The women were led into the processing building to be documented and assigned to barracks. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of Camp Hearn, something you couldn't measure or regulate or put in a report, but which every person there felt like a change in air pressure before a storm. By evening, every prisoner in the compound knew the story. Not the accurate version, but the version that mattered. The new women had arrived in chains, and the camp commander had ordered them removed before processing. Some versions had Wyatt demanding it, others had Ashford acting on his own moral conviction. Still others had the women breaking down in gratitude, which they hadn't. What mattered wasn't the accuracy, but the meaning. In a system built on control and regulation and the careful calibration of punishment and reward, someone had chosen mercy over protocol. Someone had decided that human dignity mattered more than security theater. And that choice rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. In the women's compound, the 8 new arrivals sat with the 30 women already imprisoned there and tried to explain what had happened, how they'd expected to be processed while still in chains the way they'd been handled at every other facility, how the commander had ordered the irons removed before they even entered the building, how a tall Texan with grey in his hair had stood up and promised fair treatment. "It makes no sense," said Greta Lindemann, one of the new arrivals. 26 years old, from a farming village outside Hamburg, thin like they were all thin, with blonde hair pulled back and eyes that had seen too much in too few years. "We are the enemy. Why show us this kindness?" "Because Americans are different," replied Ingrid Müller, who'd been at Camp Hearn for 3 months. 35, formerly a schoolteacher, now a prisoner far from home. "I don't fully understand it either, but they treat prisoners as humans, not just as defeated enemies. It's written in their laws, Geneva Convention, they actually follow it." "But removing the chains wasn't required by law," Greta said. "That was choice." "Yes," Ingrid agreed, "that was choice. Someone choosing to be better than the minimum required. That's what makes it meaningful. That's what makes it dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Ingrid looked at her carefully. "Dangerous because it makes you doubt everything you were taught, about Americans, about enemies, about who deserves dignity and who doesn't. Propaganda works because it's consistent. This..." She gestured vaguely at the camp around them, the clean barracks and the adequate food, and the absence of cruelty they'd been promised would be everywhere. "This breaks the propaganda. And when propaganda breaks, you have to figure out what's actually true. That's harder than just believing what you're told." Greta said nothing. She thought about the training she'd received before being sent to France. The films they'd shown about American brutality, the stories of torture and rape and casual murder. The warnings that Geneva Convention was just American propaganda, that capture meant death or worse. She thought about falling in chains this afternoon, lying in the dust with her shoulder aching and her spirit empty, waiting for the kick or the curse that would confirm everything she'd been taught. She thought about the sound of metal hitting concrete. Clang, 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 8 times. Freedom measured in the weight of falling chains. And she thought about the tall Texan who'd looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite sympathy, but was definitely human recognition, one person acknowledging another person's existence in a way that transcended categories like enemy and prisoner and German and American. She didn't understand it, didn't trust it. Had been taught too well that kindness was always a trap, that Americans smiled while they sharpened their knives, that showing weakness or gratitude or hope was the fastest way to get hurt. But the chains were off. That was undeniable. And in the calculus of prison camp survival, you had to account for facts, even when they contradicted your worldview. "I will work," Greta said finally. "I will follow rules. I will survive, but I will not trust them. Trust gets you killed." Ingrid smiled sadly. "I thought the same thing 3 months ago, but you'll see. This place, it's different. And that difference will change you whether you want it to or not." 3 days later, on September the 15th, Greta Lindemann learned her work assignment. Agricultural labor at the Thorn Farm, 15 miles outside camp. She'd be driven there each morning by civilian supervisors, work sunrise to sunset, return each evening. Fair wages credited to her Red Cross account. Good people, she was told. Treat workers right. the name of her supervisor, Wyatt Callahan. The same man who'd stood in the processing yard and promised fair treatment while she stood with freed ankles and a heart full of confusion. Greta lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, and thought about what tomorrow would bring. Another trap, probably. Another test. Another chance for the cruelty she'd been promised to finally reveal itself. She fell asleep, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still braced for the moment when American kindness would be exposed as American lies. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow morning she would eat bacon for the first time in 3 years, and that the taste of American abundance would break something inside her that propaganda had only cracked. September 15th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Wyatt Callahan's truck rattled down the dirt road toward Camp Hearn, with the sun just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of brass and copper. The Ford was older than most of the prisoners in the camp, held together by baling wire and stubbornness, but the engine ran smooth because Wyatt maintained it the way he maintained everything, with patience and attention and the understanding that tools last longer when you treat them right. He pulled up to the main gate at 6 sharp, showed his civilian employee badge to the guard, and drove through to the women's compound where Greta Lindemann waited with 2 other prisoners assigned to agricultural work details. She stood apart from the others, thin in her grey uniform, blonde hair pulled back tight, holding herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd learned that making yourself small was safer than taking up space. When she saw Wyatt's truck, something flickered across her face. Not quite fear, not quite resignation, something in between. Wyatt climbed out, touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning. Any of you speak English?" "Small," Greta said carefully, the word coming out hesitant. Learning? "That's fine. We'll figure it out." He gestured to the truck bed. "Climb in. 15-mile drive to the Thorn place. You'll be working harvest there." The 3 women climbed into the back. Wyatt noticed Greta favoring her left shoulder, the one she'd landed on when she fell 3 days ago. Probably bruised bone deep, but she didn't complain, didn't ask for special consideration, just settled herself against the truck bed wall and stared at the passing landscape with eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing. They drove in silence. The other 2 prisoners would be dropped at different farms along the route. Greta would continue on to the Thorn property, where she'd spend the next however many months working alongside Emmett and Claudia Thorn, a farm couple in their 50s who'd been using prisoner labor for 2 years now and had a reputation for fair treatment. Wyatt drove with one hand on the wheel, watching the road and thinking about the word he'd chosen to teach Greta today. He'd been doing this with the male prisoners for months now, 1 English word per day, repeated until it stuck. Helped them communicate, helped them feel less lost, cost him nothing except attention. "Harvest," he said, loud enough to carry over the engine noise. In the rearview mirror, he saw Greta's eyes flick to meet his. "Harvest." She repeated the syllables, careful and separate. "Good. Harvest. What you'll be doing today, gathering crops. Cotton mostly this time of year. Say it again. Harvest." Better this time, the word settling into her mouth like it belonged there. They dropped off the first prisoner at the Henderson place, then the second at the Mueller farm. Now it was just Wyatt and Greta, another 8 miles of dirt road stretching ahead, and a silence that felt less hostile than cautious. "Your shoulder," Wyatt said. "From when you fell, it hurt much." Greta touched her left shoulder automatically, then caught herself. "Is okay. Not bad. You favor it when you move, probably bruise the bone. Nothing you can do except let time work on it. But you should tell Mrs. Thorn if it gives you trouble. She'll understand." Greta said nothing. Wyatt could see her processing this, the idea that she should tell her captors about weakness, that admission of pain wouldn't be used against her. Another crack in the propaganda. The Thorn farm appeared over a rise in the land like a promise kept. 2,000 acres of Texas prairie, mostly cotton fields, with some cattle pasture and a vegetable garden that fed the family and sold surplus to the town. The house was white clapboard with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, the kind of house that had weathered 50 years of drought and dust storms and depression and kept standing through sheer, stubborn refusal to fall. Claudia Thorne was waiting on the porch. 50 years old, built strong from a lifetime of farm work with greying brown hair and the kind of face that showed every year but wore them well. She came down the steps as Wyatt's truck pulled into the yard. "This the new girl?" Claudia called. "Greta Lindemann," Wyatt confirmed. "From the group that came in Tuesday. She's got farm experience, family-worked land outside Hamburg." Claudia approached the truck bed where Greta stood, looked her over with the practiced assessment of a woman who'd evaluated hundreds of seasonal workers over the decades. Not cruel, not cold, just practical. "You speak English?" Claudia asked. "Small amount," Greta replied. "I learn more." "That's fine. Work speaks louder than words anyway." Claudia switched to German, the kind of broken accent, heavy German that came from a grandmother who'd immigrated in the 1880s and taught her grandchildren phrases that were probably 50 years out of date. "You work hard, you eat lunch with us. Fair." Greta's eyes widened slightly. "Eating with the family, not in a separate area, not after the family finished, but with them, like an employee, like a person." "Ja," she said carefully. "Fair." "Good. Come on then. Emmett's already in the east field. Cotton won't pick itself." The work was exactly what Greta needed. Physical, demanding, the kind of labor that occupied your hands and quieted your mind and let you exist in the simple reality of stalks and bowls and the steady rhythm of filling the canvas sack that dragged behind you down the rows. The cotton plant stood 4 feet tall, leaves already starting to yellow as the season turned. The bowls had burst open to reveal white fiber that caught the morning light like captured clouds. You grabbed each bowl, twisted, pulled, dropped the cotton in your sack, moved to the next plant, over and over. A meditation built from repetition. Emmett Thorne worked 3 rows over a tall man, weathered by 55 years of Texas sun, moving with the economical grace of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion. He didn't speak much, didn't need to speak. Just worked steadily and let Greta find her own rhythm. By mid-morning, Greta had settled into the flow of it. Her hands remembered this work from her family's farm from before the war, when picking season meant all 4 children in the fields together, her father supervising her mother bringing water and bread at midday. Back when work was just work, not survival, not punishment, just the ordinary labor of making things grow and gathering what grew. The sun climbed higher. Greta's sack filled. She emptied it into the wagon at the end of the row, started again. The bruised shoulder ached, but she ignored it. Pain was just information. You acknowledged it and kept moving. At noon, Claudia's voice carried across the field. "Lunch?" Greta straightened slowly, feeling every muscle protest. Emmett was already heading toward the house. He paused, looked back at her. "You coming?" His English was slow, clearly enunciated. "Claudia doesn't like waiting when food's ready." Greta followed him to the house, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Still certain that this kindness was temporary, that the real nature of American captivity would reveal itself soon. The kitchen smelled like heaven. Not metaphorical heaven, actual literal heaven if heaven had a smell. Greta stopped in the doorway and for a moment couldn't process what her senses were telling her, because it had been so long since food smelled like this. Bacon. 6 strips, sizzling in a cast-iron skillet, the fat rendering out and bubbling edges curling and crisping, filling the air with a smell that was equal parts salt and smoke, and something deeper, something primal that spoke directly to the oldest parts of the brain where hunger lives. Greta hadn't smelled bacon, real bacon, American bacon, thick-cut and sugar-cured since 1942. Before the serious rationing started, before meat became something you got 200 grams of per month if you were lucky and if the ration cards weren't counterfeit, and if the shop hadn't already sold out. She stood frozen in the doorway while Claudia moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs into another pan, dropping bread in the toaster, pouring coffee that smelled like it was made from actual coffee beans instead of roasted grain and chicory root. "Sit down, honey," Claudia said, gesturing to the kitchen table, where Emmett and Wyatt were already settling into chairs, worn smooth by decades of use. Greta sat, stared at the table setting in front of her. Tail. Real plate, not tin, real fork and knife, cloth napkin. Claudia brought the food, set a plate in front of Greta that made her forget how to breathe. 4 bacon strips still glistening with fat. 2 eggs, sunny side up, yolks golden and perfect. 2 slices of toast with real butter, not margarine or lard or nothing melting into the bread. A glass of milk that hadn't been watered down or reconstructed from powder. This was food for a family in Germany. Oh, this was a week's worth of rations. This was abundance on a scale that Greta's war-trained mind couldn't process. Emmett and Wyatt and Claudia started eating. Casual, normal, like this was an ordinary lunch on an ordinary day, not a feast that would have fed 6 people back home. Greta picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly. She cut a piece of bacon. The knife went through, easy, crispy outside, tender inside. She brought it to her mouth. The taste hit like a physical blow. Salt first, sharp and aggressive, coating her tongue. Then the fat melted, transforming from solid to liquid in the heat of her mouth, spreading richness everywhere. Underneath the salt and fat came something else, subtle sweetness from the sugar cure, smoke flavor from the hickory, the fundamental taste of meat that her body had been craving for 3 years without fully acknowledging it. The texture was perfect. Crispy edges that shattered between her teeth, tender center that yielded and dissolved fat that coated her tongue and throat like warm silk. Greta chewed slowly, swallowed. The bacon slid down and left a trail of salt and richness that made her entire body wake up and scream for more. She took another bite, then another. Between bites, images flooded her mind. Hamburg, 1942. Standing in line for 4 hours with ration cards to buy 200 grams of fatty sausage that was more sawdust and gristle than meat. Taking it home, stretching it across 7 days, making soup from the bones and fat rationing every bite. Hamburg, 1943. Her mother Anna boiling potato peels to make broth because the potatoes themselves had to be saved for her father, Friedrich, who worked the docks and needed calories more than the children did. Hamburg, 1944, before Greta's unit was sent to France. Bread so hard you had to soak it in water to chew it. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Turnip soup, turnip hash, turnip everything because turnips were one of the few vegetables that still grew in the depleted soil of a country that had been at war too long. And now American bacon, 4 strips, just for her. On a Tuesday afternoon, casual abundance. The guilt hit like a wave. Greta's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. The 3rd piece of bacon trembled on her fork. What was her mother eating today? What was her father having for lunch at the docks? Were they even alive? The last letter she'd received had been in June, before her capture. 4 months ago, anything could have happened. Hamburg was being bombed. Rations were getting worse. People were starving. And here she sat, eating bacon. Not just surviving, not just being fed enough to work, but eating bacon like it was normal, like she deserved it. Like she hadn't failed her country and her family by getting captured. Like she was a person instead of a prisoner. The fork clattered to the plate. Greta couldn't hold it anymore. Her vision blurred. She was crying. In front of her captors, showing weakness, breaking every rule of survival she'd learned. Claudia's hand covered hers. Warm. Calloused from work. Human. It's hard, isn't it? Claudia's voice was soft. Eating when you know others are hungry. No. When you know the people you love don't have what you have. Greta nodded, unable to speak. My grandmother came from Germany, Claudia continued. 1882, told me stories about the hunger during the hard years, how guilt tastes worse than an empty stomach, but she also told me something else. Claudia squeezed Greta's hand. She said the best way to honor people who go without is to not waste what you're given, to eat, to live, to remember. You can't help your family by starving yourself here. Wyatt spoke for the first time that meal, his voice carrying the weight of something personal. My son died fighting your country. July 6th, Normandy. Got the telegram 6 weeks ago. Greta's head snapped up. She looked at Wyatt through tears, seeing him clearly for the first time, the lines around his eyes, the grey in his hair, the careful way he held himself like a man who'd taken a wound that was still healing. Every day I ask myself why I'm alive and he's not, Wyatt continued. Why I get to eat breakfast and work and watch the sun set when Miles is buried in French dirt. I don't have an answer. But I know this being alive isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to honor the dead with. You eat, you work, you survive. And when this war ends and you go home, you help rebuild. That's how you honor the people who went without. Not by refusing food, by living well enough to make their sacrifice mean something. The kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and the faint sizzle of bacon grease cooling in the pan. Greta picked up her fork, finished the bacon, ate the eggs, the toast, drank the milk. Every bite tasted like betrayal and survival and something else she couldn't name yet. When the plate was empty, Claudia smiled. Good, now let's get you back to work before Emmett decides to pick that whole field himself and make us all look bad. The afternoon passed in a blur of cotton bowls and canvas sacks and the steady rhythm of harvest work. Greta moved through it like she was underwater, her mind still processing what had happened at lunch. The bacon, the tears, Wyatt's revelation about his son. Germans had killed Wyatt's boy. Americans had killed who Greta didn't know yet, but statistically probably someone she knew. The war was too big, too consuming, everyone had lost someone, and yet here they were. Captor and captive, enemy and enemy, sharing a meal, speaking honestly about grief, treating each other like humans instead of categories. It made no sense within the framework Greta had been taught. Americans were supposed to be cruel, heartless, capable of mercy only as propaganda, only as manipulation, only as a prelude to greater cruelty. But the bacon had been real, the tears had been understood, the grief had been shared. When Wyatt drove her back to camp that evening, he spoke one word: kindness. Greta looked at him, questioning. That's today's word, kindness. Treating people decent even when you don't have to, even when it costs you something, even when they're supposed to be your enemy. Kindness, Greta repeated. Yeah, remember it. Might be the most important word you learn. The truck rolled through the camp gates. Wyatt pulled up to the women's compound. Greta climbed out, her muscles aching from the day's work, her mind aching from something harder to name. Same time tomorrow, Wyatt said. You did good work today. Greta nodded, walked back to her barracks where Ingrid Müller waited with questions in her eyes. How was it? They fed me bacon, Greta said. The words came out flat, stunned. 4 strips, real bacon, and when I cried, they understood. I told you, Ingrid said gently, this place is different. That night, Greta lay in her bunk and thought about kindness, about bacon that tasted like betrayal and survival and unexpected mercy, about a man who'd lost his son to Germans and still chose to see a German woman as human, about chains that had been removed for no reason except that someone decided dignity mattered more than protocol. She thought about her mother Anna, her father Friedrich, her brothers Werner and Klaus, wondered if they were alive, wondered what they were eating tonight, wondered if they would understand if she told them about the bacon, about the kindness, about the slow erosion of everything she'd been taught to believe. Sleep came eventually, but it was troubled. In her dreams, she stood at a crossroads. One path led back to Hamburg, to propaganda, to the certainty of hate. The other path led forward into unknown territory, where enemies could choose kindness and bacon could taste like both guilt and grace. The days became routine. September turned to October. Wyatt's truck every morning at 6. Cotton fields under Texas sun. Lunch in the Thorn kitchen. English lessons on the drive back to camp. Harvest. Kindness, forgiveness, hope. One word per day, building a vocabulary of concepts Greta had been taught, didn't apply to enemies. By late October, she could hold simple conversations. could tell Claudia about her family's farm outside Hamburg, about the crops they'd grown, about the livestock they'd kept. Could ask Emmett about irrigation techniques and crop rotation. Could actually laugh when Wyatt taught her Texas idioms that made no sense when translated literally. The work was hard but satisfying. Her body grew stronger. The bruised shoulder healed. She filled out slightly the sharp angles of malnutrition softening with regular meals. The haunted look faded from her eyes, replaced by something cautious, but not quite broken. She was healing. And that healing felt like its own kind of betrayal. November 10th, 1944. 2 months into the routine. The Red Cross letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded through channels that stretched across an ocean and a continent, delayed by 4 months of wartime mail processing and the careful bureaucracy of neutral organizations trying to maintain connections between prisoners and the families they'd left behind. Greta Lindemann received it during evening roll call. The camp administrator handed it to her with the kind of practiced neutrality that came from delivering thousands of letters that contain news ranging from mundane to devastating. Thin envelope, cheap paper, her mother's handwriting on the outside. Postmarked June 1944. Written 4 months ago. Anything could have changed since then. Greta didn't open it immediately. She carried it back to her bunk, sat down, held it in both hands, and felt the weight of it. Letters were dangerous things in wartime. They connected you to a world you couldn't reach, reminded you of people you couldn't help, brought news you couldn't change. She opened it. The handwriting was her mother's, but shakier than Greta remembered. Anna Lindemann had beautiful penmanship, the product of a strict schooling in the 1910s when girls were taught to write like ladies. This looked like it had been written by someone whose hands weren't quite steady. My dearest Greta, I pray this letter finds you well, or as well as anyone can be in such circumstances. I write with news I wish I did not have to share. Your brother Werner is dead. The words hit like a physical blow. Greta's vision narrowed. Her hands started shaking. His plane was shot down over France on August 15th. The official notification came 3 weeks later. They did not recover his body. We are told he died serving the fatherland with honor. Your father says we should be proud. I cannot find pride, only emptiness. Klaus has been sent to the Eastern Front. We received one letter saying he arrived safely at his posting. That was 6 weeks ago. We have heard nothing since. Your father says, no news is good news. I do not believe him anymore. Hamburg is being bombed regularly now. We spend most nights in the cellar. The house still stands, but the Muller family 3 doors down was killed last week. The entire family. The children too. I cannot stop thinking about the children. Food is scarce. Your father has lost weight. I have lost weight. We eat potato soup most days when there are potatoes. Sometimes there are not potatoes. I do not write these things to burden you, my daughter. I write them because you are far away, and I want you to know what has become of us. I want you to know that we think of you, that we pray for your safety, that we hope wherever you are being treated with some measure of kindness. Come home when you can. We have already lost too much. Your loving mother, Anna Greta, read the letter 3 times. Each time the words arranged themselves into the same terrible pattern. Werner dead, Klaus missing, Hamburg bombed, parents starving, house still standing, but for how long? Her family was dissolving like sugar in water, and she was 5,000 miles away eating bacon. She didn't cry. There was something beyond crying, some state of grief, so absolute that tears seemed inadequate. She just sat on her bunk holding the letter and feeling everything inside her reorganize around this new reality. Werner, her older brother, 29 years old, who'd taught her to identify birds when she was 6, who'd joined the Luftwaffe because the recruiting posters made it look like adventure, who'd written her letters from training that were full of jokes and confidence and the unshakable certainty of young men who think they're immortal. Shot down by an American pilot. Dead in French dirt or French water, or scattered in pieces too small to recover. And Klaus, Her younger brother, 19, sent to the Eastern Front where German soldiers were dying in numbers so large they'd stopped being statistics and became just a grey blur of loss. Missing. No word. Probably dead. Greta folded the letter carefully, put it in the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions, lay down on her bunk fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling while the other women in the barracks moved around her with quiet efficiency, recognizing the shape of grief when they saw it. The next morning she climbed into Wyatt's truck at the usual time, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him, just sat in the back and stared at the passing landscape without seeing it. Wyatt glanced at her in the rearview mirror, saw something in her face that made him not ask questions, just drove. At the Thorn farm, Greta worked like a machine, mechanical, efficient, empty. She moved through the morning tasks with hands that functioned automatically, while her mind was somewhere else entirely, watching her brother's planes spiral down in flames, watching Klaus fall in some frozen Russian field, watching her mother boil potato peels and call it soup. By midday, she was in the far corner of the east field, alone with the cotton plants and the empty sky. She knelt between the rows and finally let herself break. Not crying, not exactly, just a silent shaking thing that came from somewhere deeper than tears, some place where grief lived, too large for ordinary expression. That's where Wyatt found her. He'd been checking the irrigation lines and saw her folded over in the dirt like something abandoned. He approached slowly, knelt down a few feet away, giving her space. "Bad news." His voice was quiet. Greta nodded, couldn't speak yet. "Family?" Another nod. Wyatt was silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then, "My son Miles was killed on July 6th, Normandy. German soldier shot him. Got the telegram July 18th, burned it in the kitchen stove, didn't tell anyone for 2 months." Greta looked up at him. Her face was wet, but not from crying, just from the involuntary overflow of grief that had nowhere else to go. "My brother Werner," she managed in broken English. "American pilot, August, dead. My brother Klaus, Eastern Front. Missing, probably dead." She switched to German, the words spilling out too fast for English. "My mother writes they are starving. Hamburg is being bombed. Everyone is dying, everyone, and I am here eating bacon while my family—" She couldn't finish. Wyatt didn't speak German well enough to follow all of it, but he understood enough. He understood the shape of it, the guilt of surviving while people you love suffer. The impossible mathematics of being alive in one place while death happens in another. "War makes us enemies," Wyatt said quietly. "Your brother's pilot, the soldier who shot Miles, you, me. The war needs us to be enemies so it can keep grinding people up. But grief makes us human. Grief is the thing that breaks through all the propaganda and the flags and the reasons we're supposed to hate each other." He pulled something from his pocket, a photograph worn soft at the edges from being carried and looked at too many times, a young man in army uniform, smiling, confident, alive. Miles Callahan, 24 years old, dead in French dirt. "Germans killed my boy," Wyatt said. "Americans killed your brother. Probably Russians killed your other brother. And here we sit, enemy and enemy, with the same damn hole in our chest where family used to be." Greta looked at the photograph, looked at Wyatt, saw her own grief reflected back in the lines around his eyes, the way he held himself, the careful control that came from surviving loss you didn't think you could survive. "I don't understand Americans," she said in English, the words halting but clear. "You lose son to Germans, you still give me bacon, you still treat me human? This makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense," Wyatt replied. "You didn't kill Miles. Some German soldier I'll never meet killed Miles. Just like you didn't shoot down your brother's plane. Some American pilot did. We can hate the people who pulled triggers, or we can recognize that everyone caught in this war is just trying to survive it. I chose recognize." He stood up, offered his hand. Greta took it. Let him pull her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Claudia's got lunch ready. You should eat." "I'm not hungry." I know, eat anyway. Your mother would want you to eat. It was the right thing to say. Greta followed him back to the house. Lunch that day was simpler than usual. Sandwiches, vegetable soup, fresh bread. Claudia took one look at Greta's face and understood immediately what had happened. She'd seen that expression too many times, not to recognize it. Every farm family in America had worn that look at least once since December 1941, when letters started arriving that began with, "We regret to inform you." They ate in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, just the quiet of people who understood that sometimes grief needed space more than conversation. Emmett finally spoke as they were finishing. "We got 3 boys overseas," he said. "Matthew's in France. Samuel was in the Pacific, got wounded at Saipan. Benjamin's still fighting in the Philippines." He paused. "Every night, Claudia and I go to bed wondering if tomorrow's the day we get a telegram. Every morning we wake up grateful we didn't. But we know it's coming. Might be Matthew, might be Benjamin, might be both. That's just how war works." "But you still—" Greta struggled for the English words. "You still treat me good, even knowing German soldiers maybe kill your sons." "Because you're not the one shooting at my boys," Emmett said simply. "You're just a farm girl who got caught up in something bigger than yourself. Same as my sons, same as everyone fighting this war. I can hate the war without hating you." Claudia added, "And if my boys are prisoners somewhere, I hope someone's treating them the way we're treating you, with basic human decency, because that's what separates us from the people who started this war. We remember that enemies are still human." Greta absorbed this, filed it away in the growing collection of evidence that contradicted everything she'd been taught about Americans, about enemies, about how the world worked. That evening, when Wyatt drove her back to camp, he taught her a new word: forgiveness. Greta repeated it. Forgiveness means letting go of hate, choosing to see people as human instead of holding on to anger. It's hard, maybe the hardest thing there is, but it's the only thing that stops the cycle. You forgive Germans, for miles. Wyatt thought about that for a long time. The truck rattled down the dirt road while he considered his answer. "I don't know yet," he finally admitted. "Some days I think I can. Some days I want to burn the whole world down, but I keep trying, because the alternative is letting hate run my life, and I won't give it that power. Won't let the people who killed my son also kill who I choose to be." Greta said nothing, just watched the Texas landscape roll past, and thought about forgiveness and bacon and the slow, painful work of rebuilding a worldview from the ground up. November became December through a routine that was almost comfortable. The work continued. Wyatt's morning English lessons, Claudia's kindness, Emmett's steady presence. The cotton harvest finished. They moved to winter tasks, mending fences, repairing equipment, preparing fields for spring planting. Greta's English improved rapidly. By early December, she could hold actual conversations instead of just exchanging basic phrases. She learned about Texas weather patterns, about farming techniques that differed from German methods, about American culture, through the small window of the Thorne family's daily life. She also learned about Wyatt. Small details that emerged in fragments over weeks of morning drives. He'd been married 40 years to a woman named Sarah, who died from cancer. He had a daughter, Ruth, working as a nurse in San Antonio, who still didn't know her brother was dead, because Wyatt couldn't find the words to tell her. He'd ranched his whole life, broke his first horse at age 12, lived through the Depression by being too stubborn to quit. In return, Greta told him about Hamburg, about her family's small farm outside the city, about her father working the docks, her mother managing the household, Werner's dreams of being a pilot, Klaus's love of mathematics, about the slow erosion of normal life as the war tightened its grip, first rationing, then bombing, then the constant fear that became background noise you learned to live with. They were building something, though neither of them had words for it yet. Not friendship exactly, because friendship implied equality, and they existed on opposite sides of too many divides, but something. Connection, maybe, recognition. The acknowledgement that two people could be on opposite sides of a war and still see each other as human. Then December 20th brought news that changed everything again. A telegram arrived at the Thorn farm. Claudia's hands shook as she opened it. Emmett stood beside her, face carved from stone, bracing for the blow they'd known was coming. Samuel Thorn, their middle son, had been critically wounded at Leyte Gulf. Shrapnel from a Japanese mortar had destroyed his left leg below the knee. He was being shipped stateside for medical treatment and discharge. He would live, but he would never walk the same again. Claudia wept, not from grief. Samuel was alive, but from relief and fury, and the complicated storm of emotions that came from knowing your son would survive, but would carry the war in his body for the rest of his life. 3 days later, Samuel Thorn came home. Greta was working in the barn when the car pulled up. She heard the commotion, looked out, saw a young man on crutches being helped from the vehicle by Emmett and a driver in uniform. The man's left pant leg was pinned up where it should have extended to a foot that was no longer there. Samuel was 23 years old. He'd left for the Pacific 2 years ago, wholeness personified, strong, capable, ready to serve his country. He came back, diminished, angry, haunted by things no one who hadn't been there could understand. He made it to the porch, collapsed into a chair, and that's when he saw her. Greta, in her German prisoner uniform, carrying a bucket of tools across the yard. Samuel's face transformed. All the careful control he'd maintained during the trip home shattered. "What the hell is she doing here?" His voice cracked across the yard like a whip. Claudia turned, saw what he was looking at. "Samuel, honey, that's Greta. She's been working the farm since September. She's a good worker, helps us with..." "She's German." Samuel's hands gripped the crutches so hard his knuckles went white. "You're feeding a goddamn German while I was over there fighting them. While they were killing my friends. While I lost my fucking leg. Samuel, language. Don't you dare tell me to watch my language." He struggled to his feet, swaying on the crutches. "My leg is gone, Mum. My leg, blown off by people who look just like her, who talk just like her, and you've got her eating at our table." Greta had frozen in the yard. She understood enough English to follow the conversation. Understood the hate in Samuel's voice. It was the hate she'd been expecting all along. The hate that made sense, the hate that fit the worldview she'd been taught. This was it, the moment when American kindness would be revealed as temporary, conditional, breakable. She set down the bucket, walked slowly toward the porch, stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I am sorry," she said in careful English. "I am sorry for your leg. I am sorry for war. I did not shoot you, but I am German, so I carry guilt." She paused, choosing words carefully. "If you want me to leave, I will leave." Samuel stared at her. The rage in his face warred with something else. Exhaustion, pain. The dawning realization that directing anger at this thin woman in a prisoner uniform wouldn't bring back his leg or his friends or the version of himself he'd left in the Pacific. "I don't..." He trailed off, couldn't finish. Just turned and hobbled into the house on his crutches, the screen door slamming behind him. Emmett looked at Greta with something like apology in his eyes. Give him time. Wounds take time to heal. Both kinds. Greta nodded, picked up her bucket, went back to work with the understanding that nothing was guaranteed, that kindness could be withdrawn, that she existed at the mercy of people who had every reason to hate her. That evening, Wyatt drove her back to camp in heavier silence than usual. "Samuel will come around," Wyatt said finally. "Or he won't, but that's his journey, not yours. You keep working, keep being who you are. The rest will sort itself out. And if it doesn't, then we deal with it. But you don't run from it. You don't make yourself smaller because someone else's pain is big. You just keep being human and hope that's enough." Greta thought about that. About being human in a system designed to dehumanize, about maintaining dignity when dignity wasn't required, about the exhausting, endless work of choosing to be better than the minimum required. The truck rolled through the camp gates. Another day finished. Another test survived. Greta climbed out of the truck bed, paused before walking away. "Wyatt, tomorrow's word, can it be hope?" Wyatt smiled for the first time that day. "Yeah, hope. That's a good one. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve, Captain Ashford approved Claudia's request for Greta to spend the day at the Thorn Farm, classified as a work detail, though everyone knew it was an act of kindness disguised in paperwork. Wyatt picked her up at dawn. The drive was quiet but not uncomfortable. They'd moved beyond the need to fill silence with words. The Thorn house was warm when they arrived, smelling of cinnamon and pine and something baking. Claudia had decorated with what she could, a small tree, some holly candles in the windows, making Christmas from whatever materials survived rationing and war. Samuel sat in the living room staring at nothing. He'd been home 4 days now, hadn't spoken more than necessary, hadn't looked at Greta directly, just existed in his own private hell of loss and anger, and the terrible understanding that his war was over but would never really end. "Greta's going to help me cook," Claudia announced. Not a question, a statement that allowed no argument. In the kitchen, Claudia handed Greta an apron. "Ever made pie?" "No, we had, well, different desserts in Germany." "Then you're about to learn American tradition, apple pie. 4th of July and Christmas we make pie." They worked together in the warm kitchen, Claudia teaching and Greta learning. How to roll dough thin enough to see through, how to slice apples and mix them with sugar and cinnamon, how to crimp the edge of the crust and cut vents for the steam. While the pie baked, Claudia pulled out a small box. Inside were chocolate bars, Hershey's, 4 of them. "Haven't seen chocolate in months," Claudia said. Been saving these, one for each of us today." She handed one to Greta. Greta held the chocolate bar like it was made of gold, brown paper wrapper, silver foil inside, the chocolate itself dark and glossy when she unwrapped it. She broke off one square, held it on her tongue. The chocolate melted slowly, releasing layers of flavor. Bitterness first, then sweetness flooding in, cocoa richness, sugar, a hint of vanilla. The texture transformed from solid to liquid silk, coating her entire mouth. Greta closed her eyes. Memories came unbidden. Age 8, Hamburg, 1926. Her father buying chocolate after a good harvest, dividing it among 4 children. Pure joy in a square of sweetness. Age 16, 1934. Chocolate rationed. For soldiers only. The taste becoming a memory. Age 24, 1942. Forgetting what chocolate tasted like. And now, American chocolate. Casual. Claudia had a whole box. Greta swallowed, opened her eyes, tears streaming. "What's wrong, honey?" Claudia asked softly. "My mother," Greta whispered. "She hasn't tasted chocolate in 5 years, and I have whole bar. How can I deserve this?" Claudia wrapped her arms around Greta, held her while she cried, didn't offer platitudes or solutions, just presence, just understanding. Dinner was served at 2 o'clock, the kitchen table extended with extra boards to accommodate everyone. Emmett, Claudia, Wyatt, Samuel, and Greta. In the center of the table sat a 14-pound turkey golden brown steam rising. Around it, stuffing cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes with real butter gravy, green beans, fresh rolls, and the apple pie they'd made that morning. Greta stared. This was food for 20 people in Germany, here for 5 people, and they'd have leftovers. Claudia carved the turkey, placed a huge slice on Greta's plate, 8 ounces of meat, crispy skin attached. Greta cut a small piece, fork pierced easily, brought it to her mouth. The taste was overwhelming. Salt-rubbed skin, crispy and savory, fat layer beneath pure richness. The meat itself, tender and juicy, subtle herb flavors of sage and thyme and rosemary. The texture melted perfectly cooked, not dry or tough. Greta chewed, thought about her mother eating. What if they were lucky potato soup, if not water with salt? Her hand started shaking. Fork clattered down. Wyatt spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying weight. "My son died in July. Every day, since I ask why I'm alive and he's not. I don't have an answer. But I know this being alive isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to honor the dead with. You eat, you live, you remember. That's how you keep them alive." Silence around the table. Then Samuel spoke for the first time since coming home, his voice rough from disuse. Pass the potatoes. He didn't look at Greta, but his tone was softer. Not acceptance exactly, but the first crack in the wall of hate. After dinner, while Claudia and Greta washed dishes, Samuel came into the kitchen on his crutches, stood watching. Finally, "You work hard. Mum says so. That counts for something." He left. Claudia smiled at Greta through her own tears. That's the most he's said in days. The day ended with Wyatt driving Greta back to camp. The truck cab was warm, the heater working for once. "Thank you," Greta said, "for today, for everything." "You're welcome, but you should thank Claudia. She's the one who makes it all possible." "I will, when I see her tomorrow." Wyatt glanced at her. "You're not afraid anymore? When did that change?" Greta thought about it. "The bacon, I think. When I cried, and Claudia understood, that's when I knew. You weren't pretending."
The kindness was real. It was always real. I know that now, but knowing and believing are different things. It took bacon to make me believe. Wyatt laughed, actually laughed. If someone told me back in July that bacon would defeat Nazi propaganda, I'd have called them crazy. But it did. Bacon and chocolate and turkey. Food is truth. You can lie with words, but food is honest. They pulled up to the camp gates. Greta climbed out. "Tomorrow's word?" she asked.
Wyatt thought for a moment. Peace, because that's what today was. Even with all the grief and loss and anger, for a few hours we had peace. "Peace," Greta repeated. "Yes, that is good word." January and February 1945 passed in a blur of work and waiting. The war news grew better for the Allies, worse for Germany. Cities fell, armies retreated. The end was coming visible on the horizon like a storm you couldn't outrun. In early March, Greta received another Red Cross letter, this one postmarked December 1944. "Dearest Greta, the house is gone. Bombed February 14th. We are living with neighbors in their cellar. Your father grows weaker. I do what I can. There is no news of Klaus. I fear we will never have news. The war cannot last much longer. Everyone says so. When it ends, please come home. We need you, all my love." Mother Greta read the letter to Claudia during lunch. Claudia held her while she cried, again, still. "When this is over," Claudia said, "you'll go home, you'll help them rebuild, and you'll take with you everything you learned here, about kindness, about choosing to see people as human. That's how Germany gets better, people like you teaching others." "What if I can't?" Greta asked. "Why, what if I go home and fall back into old ways?" "You won't, because you've tasted the alternative, and once you know kindness is possible, you can't unknow it. The bacon changed you, Greta. You're not the same woman who arrived in chains." May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The announcement came over the radio in the Thorn kitchen. Claudia and Emmett and Wyatt and Greta listened in silence. "It's over," Emmett said quietly. "Not for Germany," Greta replied. "For Germany, it is just beginning." Later that day, Captain Ashford called a general assembly at the camp. All prisoners gathered in the yard. "The war in Europe is over," Ashford announced in German. "You will remain here until repatriation can be arranged. This may take weeks or months. Continue your work details. Continue to conduct yourselves with dignity. When you return home, you will carry with you the knowledge that you were treated fairly under American custody. Remember that. Teach it to others." In the women's compound that night, the mood was strange. Relief mixed with dread. The war was over, but Germany was defeated, destroyed. They would return to rubble and starvation and occupation. "What will you do?" Ingrid asked Greta. "Go home. Find my mother. Help rebuild." Greta paused. "And I will tell everyone about this place, about the cowboy who removed chains, about the farmer family who fed me turkey, about Americans who chose kindness when they didn't have to. Will they believe you? Probably not, but I will tell them anyway. Truth doesn't need belief to be true." Repatriation orders came in late August. Greta would leave September 12, 1945, exactly 1 year after arriving in chains. Her last week at the Thorn farm felt weighted with significance. Every task became a goodbye, every meal a memory being formed. On her final day, September 11th, Claudia gave her gifts: a Bible, English, German, with notes written in the margins, recipes, advice, prayers, a photograph of the Thorn family signed on the back, to Greta, who taught us that enemies can become family, with love always. A letter of reference in Emmett's careful handwriting. To whom it may concern, Greta Lindemann worked on our farm for 12 months. She is hard-working, honest, skilled and trustworthy. Any employer would be fortunate to have her. And seeds, enough for an entire garden. Tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots. Plant these when you get home, Claudia said. Feed your mother. Remember us? Greta also received her pay, $480 accumulated over a year of work. A fortune in post-war Germany. Samuel, who'd slowly thawed over the months, shook her hand. "You're all right," he said gruffly. "For a German." Greta smiled. "You are all right. For a man who lost his leg." It was the first time she'd acknowledged his injury directly. Samuel's expression flickered. Then he smiled back. Small, but real. September 12th, 1945. 1 year exactly. Wyatt drove Greta to camp for the last time. They stopped. The truck, halfway, pulled over on the side of the dirt road. Texas prairie stretched in all directions, endless sky, horizon so far you could see the curve of the earth. 1 year ago, Greta said, I arrived in chains. Today I leave free, because of you. Not because of me, because you chose to let yourself be free. The chains were easy to remove. The real work was everything after. I will come back, Greta said suddenly. When Germany is rebuilt, 20 years maybe, I will come back to Texas, to thank you properly. I'll be here, Wyatt replied. Old and slow, but here. You promise? I promise. You rebuild Germany. I'll keep this ranch running, and in 20 years you come back and we'll sit on the Thorn porch and watch the sunset together. They shook hands. Then impulsively Greta hugged him. Wyatt stiffened in surprise, then hugged her back. Father and daughter almost, or something like it. Thank you, Greta whispered, for 3 words, for take them off, for changing everything. You're welcome. Now go home. Your mother needs you. The voyage back to Germany took 2 weeks. Greta stood on deck as the ship approached Bremerhaven, seeing her homeland for the first time in over a year. The coastline looked scarred. Cities showed bomb damage. Everything looked broken. She disembarked with 200 other prisoners. They were processed, documented, given basic supplies, released into an occupied Germany that felt more foreign than Texas had. Greta found her mother living in a damaged building outside Hamburg. Anna Lindemann was 51 years old but looked 70. 82 pounds, hollow cheeks, hands that shook constantly. Greta! Her mother's voice cracked. Is it really you? They held each other and cried. That night, in a corner of a bombed-out building sharing a thin blanket, Anna asked, Tell me about America, tell me about captivity. Greta told her, about arriving in chains, about the Texas cowboy who said, take them off, about the silence that followed, about bacon and chocolate and turkey, about Claudia and Emmett and Samuel, about Wyatt teaching her English 1 word at a time, about the slow transformation from prisoner to person. I don't understand, Anna said. They defeated us. Why show mercy? Because they believed it was right, Greta replied. Because their system values human dignity even for enemies. Because a cowboy saw a woman fall in chains and decided that was wrong. And said so, and was heard. She pulled out the seed packets Claudia had given her. And now I will rebuild. With these seeds, with what I learned, with the knowledge that enemies can choose to be human. By spring 1946, Greta had planted a garden in the rubble. Tomatoes grew in June, beans in July. Her mother gained weight, color returned to her cheeks. Greta worked teaching English to German children, married Carl in 1947, a former prisoner who'd also been held in America, who'd also learned that kindness was possible even in captivity. They had 2 daughters, 1949 and 1952. Greta taught them English, taught them about Texas, taught them that the world was bigger than propaganda, that enemies could choose kindness, that chains were easy to remove once someone decided they were wrong. In 1965, 20 years after leaving Texas, Greta Lindemann returned. She was 47 years old now, her daughters were 16 and 13, her mother miraculously still alive at 72, her husband Carl beside her. They flew to Houston, rented a car, drove to the small town outside which the Thorne farm still operated. The house looked the same. White clapboard, wraparound porch, smoke from the chimney. Claudia Thorne came to the door, 71 years old now, hair fully grey, but the same strong presence. Her eyes widened. "Greta, I came back. I promised I would come back." They fell into each other's arms, both crying, both laughing. Emmett emerged from the barn, 76, now moving slower but still working. "Well, I'll be damned, you actually came back." Samuel ran the farm now. 44 years old, married 3 children. He walked with a prosthetic leg but walked steady. Shook Greta's hand with genuine warmth. "Been wondering if you'd show up. Dad bet you would. Mum said you'd promised." "I always keep promises," Greta replied. They spent the afternoon catching up. Greta's daughters played with Samuel's children in the yard, former enemies' grandchildren laughing together, but one person was missing. "Where is Wyatt?" Greta asked finally. Claudia's expression shifted. "Oh, honey, I thought you knew. Wyatt, he passed 8 years ago, 1957. Heart gave out. He was 74. The world tilted. Greta sat down hard on the porch steps. "He never—" She couldn't finish. "He talked about you often," Emmett said gently, "especially toward the end. Said you were proof that doing the right thing mattered, that one choice could echo for decades. I wanted to thank him, properly. I promised I would come back." "Well, you did come back," Claudia said. "You're here. That would have meant everything to him." They drove to the cemetery the next day. Small plot behind a white church. Wyatt's headstone was simple. Wyatt Callahan, 1883 to 1957. He chose kindness. Greta knelt beside the grave, placed flowers, wept for the man who'd seen her fall in chains and decided that was wrong. "I came back," she whispered, "like I promised. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm sorry you didn't wait, but I'm here. And everything you taught me, I taught my daughters. They're teaching their children. Your kindness didn't die with you. It's still alive, growing, like the seeds Claudia gave me." She stood, wiped her eyes, placed her hand on the headstone. "Thank you for 3 words. Thank you for changing everything." In 1972, Greta wrote a letter. She was 54 years old, living in Hamburg, grandmother to 5. Germany had rebuilt, prospered, become something different from what it had been. "Dear friends, I am writing to tell you something I'm not sure you fully understand. When Wyatt asked Captain Ashford to remove our chains when he stood in that yard and promised we'd be treated fairly when you fed me bacon and chocolate and turkey, you saved more than my body. You saved my faith in humanity. You proved that enemies can choose decency, that power doesn't require cruelty, that one person saying, 'Take them off,' can change the world. I built my post-war life on that lesson. I taught my children. They teach their children. Your simple act echoes through generations. Thank you for that. Thank you for seeing chains and deciding they were wrong. Thank you for being the kind of people who fix what's broken, even when what's broken is just someone's dignity. With eternal gratitude, Greta Lindemann." Greta Lindemann died in 2005, age 87. Her last words to her great-grandchildren were, "Always choose to take the chains off." Her funeral was attended by 200 people, Germans who'd learned from her, Americans who'd known her story, former prisoners and children of prisoners, people whose lives had been touched by the choice one Texas cowboy made on a September afternoon in 1944. The story of the chains at Camp Hearn became legend, not the dramatic kind with heroes and villains, The quiet kind, the kind that reminds us that the most important choices are often the smallest ones. One man seeing a woman fall in chains and deciding that was wrong. 3 words, take them off. One moment of choosing mercy over protocol. And from that moment, a life changed, a family rebuilt, a country taught, generations transformed. Because sometimes the best victories come not from defeating enemies, but from choosing to see their humanity and act accordingly. The chains came off on September 12, 1944. They never went back on. And in that freedom, something grew that was more powerful than any weapon, more lasting than any treaty, more transformative than any victory. The simple, devastating recognition that enemies are human, and humans deserve dignity, always, even in war, especially in war. One choice, one moment, one cowboy who decided kindness mattered more than protocol. That's how wars truly end. Not with surrender documents, but with bacon and chocolate and turkey, with chains removed, with dignity restored, with one person saying to another, "You are human," and that matters more than anything else.